His name is Tom Cotton. We're talking about Tom and a bunch of other issues. Senator from Arkansas, great patriot, served in the military in combat, and is really one of the great thinkers in the U.S. Senate, too. Senator Cotton, how are you, my friend?
I'm great, Mark. Thank you for having me on with you. It's always good to be back.
It's my pleasure. Now, I seem to recall that you were the first one, and I brought this up on radio and TV, to accuse the Communist Chinese of having that leak at their lab that resulted in this massive pandemic. And you took a lot of hell for that, didn't you?
Yeah, Mark. In fact, I think it's the 5-year anniversary of that week. You know, I said, gosh, there's this giant super lab right down the street, and they research bat-based coronaviruses, and they have a shoddy safety history, and the director is literally nicknamed the Bat Lady. And bats are not indigenous to this region of China, and there are no bats in that food market. So maybe this thing came out of a lab in Wuhan. And, I expected Chinese communist apparatchiks to attack me, but I think most Americans were probably surprised at how many American elites manned the ramparts on behalf of China as well, as the Washington Post, and CNN, and the New York Times. And I recount that in my new book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China.
And I also recall that the New York Times editorial page, after they published your op-ed piece, got very, very angry when you suggested you may have to actually send in the military to put down these riots in Washington, D.C. and the attacking of the White House. Remember that one?
I do, yes. There was an uprising and a rebellion at the New York Times. I think they even fired the editor over it.
Yeah, well, let me say this. This book you've written, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. I'll tell you why I love this book. Number 1, it's very readable. Number 2, there's no varnish in this thing. You lay it out. And you really, you do comprehensively lay out the case against Communist China. And the Communist China, both internally and overseas, is stealing our information. They are stealing our military information. They are geographically encircling us. And you go on and on about this regime, things I didn't even know. And I study this stuff all the time. So first of all, what motivated you to write this book?
Mark, I wanted to ring the alarm on the threat that China poses to us in an immediate, concrete, everyday way, to our country, to our way of life, to you and to your family. Most Americans have a justly low opinion of communist China, but I've discovered in my conversations with Arkansans over the year that there is a lot they don't know about China. And I think some of it is because so many of our elites are co-opted or compromised by Chinese influence. So this kind of synthesizes everything I've seen and learned about China in the last 10-plus years in the Senate, on the Armed Services Committee, on the Intelligence Committee, and now as chairman of the Intelligence Committee. And as you said, I wanted to make it easy and readable. It's only about 170 pages. It's a small book. I want Americans to be able to pick it up and finish it, maybe in a couple bedtimes or maybe on a single flight or train ride, because I want as many people to know that the threat is real, it's imminent, and it's here today. It's not something that's in the distant future or just about grand strategic politics.
China's spending a massive amount of its gross domestic product on its military. Now, it's not doing that for internal security. It's not doing that to attack Taiwan or the Philippines. They're preparing for war, aren't they, Senator?
They are, and you can tell that not just by their rhetoric, in which they're very clear that they want to forcibly annex Taiwan into mainland China, but look at the money that they've been spending. Over the last 25 years, they've had a more than 1,000% increase in their military spending. It's the biggest and most rapid military buildup in history. Nations don't make that kind of investment of their national wealth without being deadly serious and in earnest. And Xi Jinping has been entirely clear that he views Taiwan as the last festering wound to settle all of Communist China's grievances and to be the springboard for Chinese communist ambitions, which is to replace the United States as the world's dominant economic and military power.
And in this, you and President Trump agree, right? Because he wants to rebuild our energy sector. He wants to build our industrial might in the central part of, in America. He wants to rebuild our financial system. He sees what communist China is doing, and he's very concerned about it, and he's acting on it, isn't he?
Oh, absolutely, Mark. In fact, there's no question that Donald Trump is the strongest president on China we've had since the end of the Cold War. he may even be the strongest president we've ever had on communist China since Mao won the Civil War in 1949. The only one that could give him any competition would be Eisenhower, and that's only because Ike twice threatened to nuke China over Korea and Taiwan. That's what it takes to give Donald Trump any competition on this front. But what President Trump did in his first term was really change the conventional wisdom about China. For too long, both parties had thought, oh, if we trade with China, even if they take advantage of us, if we build them up and they become wealthy, they'll moderate politically, they'll stop oppressing their people, they won't threaten us. The exact opposite has happened. In one of the great strategic blunders in American history, we have actually fueled the economic rise and therefore the military rise of our most dangerous competitor. President Trump reversed all that in his first term, and he's starting to build on it in his second term.
And you lay this out. You lay out how internally also it's loaded with concentration camps and killing fields, whether it's the Uyghurs or Christians or the Tibetans, right?
Yeah, and Mark, just let me take Christians, because I do think many Americans are aware, because of activism and news coverage about the genocide in Tibet over the last many decades and the more recent genocide against the religious and ethnic minority known as the Uyghur people. But the Christian persecution is awful as well. Many Arkansans are surprised to learn that China is one of the largest Christian nations in the world. By some estimates, they have 100 million practicing Christians. More than half of them have to practice their faith in private and secret unregistered churches, because the other half have to register in churches where they're monitored and spied on and influenced by Chinese communists. And those unregistered Christian churches face the risk of demolition, of arrest, of torture, even of murder. And China is even trying to edit the Bible, Mark, to change the word of God and replace it with the word of Mao. It is one of the worst nations in the world for the persecution of Christians.
Well, here is Senator Tom Cotton, a great patriot. Senator has written this fantastic book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. Folks, I encourage you to get it. Go to Amazon.com. It just came out today. It's a very, very important book. He lays out the whole case about the threat that China is, and he and President Trump have been talking about this for some time. You have in your book here, China's waging economic war against the United States, and that's something President Trump is fighting back about. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Mark, I'm always amused, as I write in the book, when I see the liberal media say that, President Trump is starting an economic war against China. No, that's not the case. China has been waging an economic world war, most especially against the United States, for decades. President Trump just joined the war in 2017 and continues to battle it now. China has used a combination of propping up its own companies and attacking our companies to undermine our workers and our industry and our wealth. So in China, it does things like currency manipulation, subsidizing companies, state ownership or influence or direction of companies, even using slave labor, all of which is designed to get their costs down so they can dump products in the United States and in our allies and devastate our economies. They also attack our companies, sometimes through old-fashioned espionage, having spies in a company's buildings, through cyber attacks. They steal intellectual property. They steal schematics, designs, blueprints, trademarks. They also force American companies through working in China and doing business there to go into joint ventures, and then force them to transfer their technology to the Chinese partner in the joint venture, and then they kick the American company out. And they've been doing this for decades, and unfortunately, we aided and abetted it for a long time until 8 years ago. President Trump said, we're going to put an end to this. And we finally had a president who stood by his campaign promises, unlike people like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, who promised to crack down on communist China and never did.
And, of course, we had, in my view, the Biden family that was on the take. That's a whole other story. You write here in a very, very important chapter, Chapter 5, and I went back and read it again, that China has infiltrated our government. Explain to the American people what you mean by that.
Well, Mark, you just gave a great example. Look at how Chinese communists cultivated Hunter Biden as an ally, as a business partner, and funneled millions of dollars into his pockets to enrich the Biden family, all of whom are now pardoned by Joe Biden for the period in question so they can never be charged with any crimes. But it's not just people as prominent as the Biden family. Many people in Washington are working on behalf of China. They're part of what I call the New China Lobby, former congressmen and senators, aides, administration officials. They go to work for Chinese-owned or directed or influenced companies. They are de facto lobbyists, therefore, for the Chinese government. But it's not just in Washington, D.C. It's also happening out in our state capitals and our local governments as well, because China knows those state and local officials can act as de facto lobbyists. You know, if you open a big company or site in someone's city, they're probably going to ask their congressman to pipe down about China, and not just about that trading relationship, but say about Tibet or Hong Kong. Second, it's kind of a farm team. Look at Eric Swalwell. He was co-opted by a Chinese agent who was initially a supporter and then apparently a romantic partner. That's a good example of how China wants to start early at the state and local level, because they know those politicians sometimes go on to Congress or maybe even to the White House. And third, in the meantime, they can use those state and local officials to get all kinds of economic benefits, tax breaks, land grants, subsidies, relaxed regulation as they chase after Chinese business. So it is pervasive in our society that China is running influence operations against our governments, against colleges and universities, against cultural institutions like Hollywood or professional sports, and I lay it all out in 7 Things You Can't Say About China. One of the reasons it's hard to say some of these things is because China has so much leverage and influence in American society.
This is an absolutely crucial book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. Now, you mentioned entertainment and professional sports. I mean, they really do have control, don't they, over the movie industry, because if you run a movie that dares to criticize them or uses language they don't like, they're not going to run it in China. And these companies, they want to run these movies in China because of all the people that they go to the movie theaters in China, right? And same with professional sports. The purchasing of we saw this with LeBron James, the purchasing of his clothing and so forth.
Yeah, Mark, I mean, we haven't seen a movie with a Chinese villain really since at least the mid-1990s. In 1997, Brad Pitt starred in 7 Years in Tibet. The Chinese communists came down on him and his studio like a ton of bricks. Hollywood got the picture. If they wanted access to the massive and lucrative Chinese movie market, they could have no Chinese villains. So all the great movies you saw with Russian villains during the Cold War, you don't see anything like that against China right now. Likewise, Mark, consider our news media. Every major news network, except for Fox News, is owned by or affiliated with one of those Hollywood studios. Mm-hmm. Do you really think that ABC is going to tell you the bare facts and truth about China when they're owned by Disney, which doesn't just want to access the movie market in China, but also has massive theme parks there? I certainly don't think so.
And higher education, I mean, they've butt themselves right into the classroom in these colleges and universities, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. I mean, Chinese nationals are the single largest foreign student population at our universities. Most of these students are somehow affiliated with, related to, or aligned with Chinese Communist Party officials or the People's Liberation Army leadership. They usually pay full freight tuition. Universities use that to underwrite their budget because you have all of these Chinese coming in and paying the full freight for tuition so they can give breaks to other students or more scholarships or spend money on campus infrastructure and so forth. Until Donald Trump shut them down, you had so-called Confucius Institutes, which were really little more than outposts on campus of Chinese espionage. And there are direct grants, too, that China, either directly or through intermediaries, makes massive grants the way American philanthropists do to our universities, and they're not even disclosed. It's supposed to be disclosed. That's what the law demands. But the Department of Education, until the final days of the Trump administration, has never enforced those disclosure requirements, and they went back to that practice in the Biden administration. That's just another example of how China co-ops higher education in America.
And China has built these strong alliances now with Russia, with North Korea and Iran. This it's not an iron triangle, it's an iron square, if you will. And this is of grave concern to us, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, Chinese weaponry is being used in Ukraine right now by Russians. China has always protected North Korea. It's always been a fiction that China would want to stop North Korea from going nuclear or would be a partner in trying to denuclearize North Korea. Why would they do that? They know those missiles aren't going to fly to the west and hit China because North Korea knows what would happen. They know those missiles might fly one day to the east, or maybe more to the point that it's a massive, grave danger to the United States that you have a nuclear-armed North Korea with missiles that can hit the United States. So we spend immense amount of political and diplomatic time and effort dealing with that problem. Take that problem away, and we could spend all that time and effort on China. So China has always underwritten North Korea, and the same thing with Iran. China and Iran have a rich and deep trading relationship. China has been getting oil from Iran despite sanctions. They also have a lot to do in the weapons trade as well.
China is in Central America, South America, the Panama Canal. China's all through our hemisphere, isn't it?
They are. They don't have any military bases yet, but they aspire to it. That's one reason why President Trump wanted to try to change the status of Greenland, because it's critical terrain too. But take a look at the Panama Canal Zone. It is a fact that Chinese companies are operating on both sides of that zone. And that's a grave threat to our national security and our economic prosperity. What if China undertook efforts to try to shut that canal during a period of tension over, say, Taiwan or trade policy? China also is establishing very deep economic and trading relationships with a lot of Latin America, or it's part of their so-called Belt and Road Initiative, in which they're spending more than $1 trillion around the world to build up infrastructure, often with no real economic purpose, except for a way to build up favors for third world countries and make them more beholden to China.
You know, America, we barely touched the surface in this book, and it's laid out so beautifully. You can really knock this out on one night or one weekend, and you'll know more about what Communist China is doing and the grave threat that we face economically, politically, geographically, militarily, and that it has, in fact, insinuated itself into every aspect of this country. It's a very, very important book that the Communist Chinese, I guarantee, don't want you to read. I strongly encourage you to read it. You can get it on Amazon.com. It just came out today. Amazon.com, any major bookstore. But if you want it tomorrow or the next day, you get it at Amazon.com. It'll drop off, and you'll see what I mean about how readable this is. It's not written for eggheads and people like that. It's written as an alarm to we, the people. 7 Things You Can't Say About China by Senator Tom Cotton. Great book, Senator. I want to thank you for writing it, and God bless you, my friend.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate you.
All right, you too. Take care of yourself.